Some of you may have heard about them, and some of you may wish you hadn't been part of them. But I will tell whatever I feel pertinent. There is one honored guest here, Janice Embody Redsicker, her father, Freddie Embody, started the Millstream Inn around 1936. Or early 37, with his wife Angeline. And Angeline came from Endicott. Was her family?
She was a native of Candor. She was born.
But she had family in Endicott. A lot of family.
They all, several of the older ones moved to Endicott.
Okay. So 1936. I have a menu from the first menu of the Millstream Inn. If any of you wanted to dine there tonight, you could get spaghetti and meatballs for 30 cents. And when I was young, I think it had gone up to $1 for spaghetti and meatballs. I would have probably ordered pork chops. They were 50 cents. That would be a quarter a piece, I think. So. Bacon and eggs, 40 cents. Hamburg, 10 cents. And there was no golden arches in front of the Millstream. And a Schlitz beer was 15 cents. A bottle of Schlitz beer was 15 cents. That's what you drank, wasn't it, Arlene?
Yeah. I still do. Yeah, right.
I think one of the things about the Millstream Inn that is most important to remember that it was sort of the social center of Candor for many, many people, especially shortly after it was originated, World War II happened. And there's a lot of stories about World War II, some of which Janny can probably help me with, but I wasn't around yet, which was probably a good thing. But
Philip, I can tell you that my father gave dinner to those who were drafted from Candor, Spencer, and Benetton, and the whole room was full of these gentlemen. And I was a little girl then, but I can remember them.
Those drafted into World War II.
World War II.
One of those drafted into World War II was my Uncle Howard.
Yes.
And they called him Ikey.
He gave Dad his boots.
He had hip boots, and he always had a feeling that he wasn't going to come home from the war. And everybody considered Freddie Embody their friend, so he took his boots up and gave them to Freddie and said, I want you to have these. If I come home, they'll be here, but if I don't, they're yours. And Janny had them for years and years, and just in the last couple of years, I think, got rid of them. And so they had the waiters there, and as we know, he did not come home from the war. He was killed in France in 1944. On August 7th of 1944, he was killed. Another interesting story about that with my family is that my father was mustering out of the service, and they made an announcement. They wanted him to come home as soon as he could. He was at Fort Dix mustering out in New Jersey. He didn't hear the call, so he came home, and when people came to town, the bus stopped in front of the Millstream. And he got out, and he went into the Millstream, and Marie said to him, I'm so glad you got home in time. And he says, what are you talking about? An hour later, his father's funeral was to be held, so he got home an hour before his father's funeral. Another fellow that had been missing in action or a prisoner of war for several years was Irvin Schoonover. And I remember Marie Ahart, Janny's sister, telling the story how the bus stopped in front of the Millstream and Scooney was thought to have been killed in the war. And he got off the bus and walked in the Millstream and everybody thought they were seeing a ghost. And he had been a prisoner of war for I think 3 to 5 years. He'd been missing for...
I don't know, he was in several of the different areas of war.
Yeah, in Europe, so, yeah.
Africa and Europe.
So Marie Ahart, Janny's sister, was married to Ralph Ahart, who tended bar at the Millstream, and Ralph was always wore a white shirt and a tie to tend bar, and always it was demanded that you wear a white shirt and tie. And Ralph was a great guy, and he died young with an infection in the brain. And he was only like 58 years old, I think, when he died. He wasn't real old at all. Marie, at that time, was sort of the warden of the place. I got to see her in action once in a while when she would send people on their way, you know, and there was always fun at the Millstream. It wasn't a bar, it was a tavern where you could go and have a good time and a respectable time. And if there was anything shady, you were expected to leave, you know. And during the 60s, 50s and 60s, it was the headquarters for a race car driver, some of you may remember, Bullet Bill Strozel. And he drove a white car, number 15, as I remember. And the Millstream had all of the trophies that he won. Along the left wall there was a shelf, and all of his trophies were there. And every Saturday night about 10:30, the Millstream was packed with the fans of Bullet Bill Strozel. And that was always a fun time. When I was young, Janny's mother, Angeline, whose nickname was Chi-Chi, Chi-Chi, when it was time to close, and there wasn't, as long as I think the rule was, as long as you had a beer in front of you, you could stay until like 4 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and so when it was time to close, Angeline, Chi-Chi would often come out and play Good Night Irene or Good Night Ladies on the piano. And speaking of the piano, I know I wasn't around at that time, but I know that Bob Pompelli used to play the piano there, and some of you might remember Bob Pompelli. He could play the piano any song you ever wanted. I did get to hear him play, not at the Millstream, but I got to hear him any song you wanted, and he couldn't read music. He just could play it by playing it.
Yeah, by ear.
By ear, yeah. So that was something that everybody certainly enjoyed. Bob had 3 sons that terrorized Candor a little bit. But there was Mike, George, and Chuck. Mike, George, and Chuck were there. When I was in my mid-teens one night, I lived down on Humiston Street, and of course there was no air conditioning, the screens were in the windows, and I heard this terrible crash, and I knew that it had to be uptown because I heard this crash. And the next day I found out that Tommy Fitzpatrick had hit the bridge, and he was in the passenger side. I believe it was a young man named Tommy Moulthrop, I think, was driving. And Tommy had his hand up on the window like this, and the car hit between the car and the bridge, and he walked in the Millstream, and his hand was nearly severed. And Marie and everybody there kept him calm until they could get him to the hospital. Of course, back then, well, I guess the ambulance squad was on then, but prior to
Last
that,
one.
Myron Miller would show up with the hearse with a yellow light on top of it. If they took the yellow light off, you knew you didn't make it. So, one of the things I remember about the Millstream Inn is the jukebox. You could get 6 songs for a quarter. 6 songs for a quarter. And even though the people wanted to change how many songs you got for a quarter, they wouldn't let them change it. They wanted 6 songs for a quarter, so you could certainly enjoy yourself there for a good half hour for a quarter. They originally had a shuffleboard pinball type machine along one wall. And the thing I really liked later in life, after I got where I could drink a little bit, is the men's room was just this wide. So you could stand there and not fall over. And so I really thought that was a really good idea as far as that goes. When I got to be old enough to drink, I could serve drinks. So I was in college, and my second year of college, at Corning Community College, I had worked in Johnny's store, and I also got a job for Sunday nights at the Millstream Inn. Johnny gave me a job as a bartender. I graduated from high school. I weighed 122 and I was 5'4", so I could just about see over the top of the bar. And I was always worried that somebody might come in and start a fight, and so I always planned what my exit would be if there was a fight that started. And my training bartender was Corky Newman. And of course, Corky was a real tall fella. And the first night I tended bar, Corky came down Sunday night and sat at the bar and sort of watched me. I think that was sort of a planned thing. And the second night I tended bar was the Sunday night, and I was tending bars probably around 9, 10 o'clock at night, and Cub Dents and his brother-in-law, Carl Andrews, came in. They'd been out snowmobiling. They had a beer. They didn't even finish their beer. And Renee Haig was there, and she was telling Cub, I want you to take me for a ride on that snowmobile. And he said, I'm not taking you for a ride on the snow. Yes, you are. So they all left, got on the snowmobile, and Renee went to put her leg over the snowmobile, and Cub pulled right out from under her. And 5 minutes later, it wasn't even 5 minutes, I hadn't even taken their bottle off the bar yet, and I got a call, and it was Mrs. Townsend. Says, Roger's out plowing snow, can you go find him? There's been a fatal accident up past the Legion. And I knew it had to be them. And so we went out and found Roger, and he went up to the Legion. Sure enough, it was Cub. He had been killed. Guy Kinney had a white car. It had just snowed, and the snow had covered the white car, and he hit the car head on and was killed. And that was my second night attending bar, and it was a little traumatic for me, and difficult time, but yet Cub died doing things he enjoyed, and that was sort of the tragedy of that night for me. The first night I tended bar, and Corky was there sitting at the end of the bar, and I was a little runt. A guy walked in, and nobody we knew. He walked in, he says, I'm going to walk the end of this bar from one end to the other. I'm going to stand on this bar. And Corky had told me, if somebody gives you trouble, look him right in the eye. and tell him you mean business. So I looked up at this guy, and I says, no, you're not. And he says, yes, I am. And my legs were going like this, and I said, no, you're not. And he says, yes, I am. And he started to get up, and Corky stood up. And of course, Corky was like over 6 foot. Excuse me. And he says to the guy, I don't think you are. You might get through him, but you aren't going to get through me. And so the guy finished his beer and left. So I've always appreciated Corky training me for such disturbances. Very seldom was there ever a fight at the Millstream. But one time I was having a hamburger when hamburgers were 50 cents at the Millstream. They'd gone from 10 cents up to 50 cents. Jerry Ahart was a dear friend of mine, and we were sitting having a hamburger on a Sunday afternoon, and a group came in that lives over from Slaterville way, and they sat behind us, and I heard them talking, and the one woman says, I planted that garden. The other woman says, the hell you did, I planted that garden. And they were all pretty inebriated, and they got in a fight. The 4 of them, the 2 men, the 2 women were fighting, and Marie sort of dragged them to the door and kicked them out. They got in a fight outside, so of course us boys went out to watch to see who won. And by the time we got out there, the one woman had ripped the other woman's blouse off, and she stood there in just her, back then they were called brassieres, and she stood there in her bra, and the one man says, any man that rips a blouse off, any woman that rips a blouse off a woman ain't no damn good. And the other guy says, well, you're talking about my wife. And he says, you're right, I am. So they got in a fight, and then the cops came and settled everything. So that got resolved. After Janny closed the Millstream, Evelyn and Leo Cron took over, right?
Yes.
Evelyn and Leo Cron took over, and they had a lot of family help. They had a lot of people working there. They also had a German Shepherd dog.
St. Bernard.
St. Bernard, I mean. It was Brutus, was that the name of it?
I don't remember.
But when you sat and ate, the dog would come and look at you. And drool all over south floor table, whatever. But anyway, that's the memory. And Leo and Evelyn Cron, certainly, they had it for several years. Finally, I think Brutus was asked to leave. I think maybe the health department asked Brutus to leave.
I asked him to leave.
Oh, okay. Janny asked him to leave. But anyway, they were gone. One of the bartenders was Ron Potter. Scott's here tonight. He tended bar for a number of years. Ron did at the Millstream, and did a great job. He was retired military, right?
Yes.
He was retired military, and he continued on tending bar for a long time at the Millstream, but he had heart-related issues that sort of made it so he couldn't tend bar. I took over the Millstream in 1981. The first night I was to open, we were going to have, we were hosting the St. Mark's Episcopal Church women to dinner. Had the dinner all set, and at 5 minutes of 5, when they were to come, it had snowed a little bit that day. They called and canceled. So I sort of said things that a preacher shouldn't have said, but I wasn't a preacher at that time. But anyway, we opened, and I was there for about 5 years. I did my psychic shows. We did comedy shows there. We had a really fun time. I turned it sort of into an Irish pub, but maintained the Millstream Inn. again, it was a place where families could go and enjoy. And that's what it was throughout the ownership of it. It was a place that people could go, kids could go there and swim at the dam because everyone learned to swim at the dam. A lot of water over the dam. Matter of fact, the dam's gone. And so we all learned to swim at the dam, and then we'd go to the Millstream and get a hamburger for 50 cents. And so that was a fun time. And often we would get to see some of the bathing beauties at the dam, two of which were two older women who would swim up the back part of the dam way up around the bend. Some of you may remember those two women bathing beauties. One was named Catherine Truman, and one was named Bev Robinson. And they would often get together on the beach behind the Millstream, and they would sit and visit, and then they would swim up the creek and swim back, and they were endurance swimmers, and I was pretty sure they were training for the Olympics. But I don't remember seeing them in the Olympics. One of the groups that I had that played music there several times, many times, was called the XYZ Club Band. And it was a group of 3 black fellas from Ithaca who were in their mid to late 70s, but they played 40s and 50s music, and I really enjoy that era of music. And their names was Doc, Wally, and Cookie. And they would sit afterwards, and we'd make food for them, and we'd sit and talk. And they told about when they were younger playing at clubs in Utica, New York. And they would provide the music, and then they would have to go, if they wanted to eat, the place would feed them. But because they were black, they had to go out in the alleyway to eat. And that was in the 1950s that happened. And Doc, who was very funny, he would say, yeah, and a lot of times there was bullets flying over our head, too. And but the prejudice that humans have doesn't seem to diminish. It just keeps continuing. But I always admired those fellas because their love for music was not detained at all because of the prejudice that came about with them. And they were all very talented people. They had other occupations, but they loved their music and continued to play the music. I had a Friday night fish fry, which I had a notable woman pianist there, and her name was Winnie Allen. Some of you may remember Winnie playing for the fish fries, and she absolutely loved that. She very much enjoyed playing there. Then I also had Rick Pedro play quite often, and Rick still plays for various groups and organizations. While I was at the Millstream, the feed mill was right next door that's been torn down, and there was a cat living in that mill that every Friday night at the fish fry, she would come over and run in the door of the Millstream and try to get some fish. So, because she only came at night, I named her Blanche, after Blanche Dubois, the story there where Blanche Dubois was the lady of the night. And so I got Blanche. The vet said she was 3 years old when I took her to the vets to have her surgery. And he said she's 3 years old. I had her for 24 more years. So she lived to be 27. And she was diagnosed with cancer, and he said she's got 3 months to live. This was when she was 24. So I said, well, I will feed her shrimp and chicken so she can enjoy the rest of her life. And I cooked shrimp and chicken for 3 years. She lived to be 27 years old, but that's one memento I had from the Millstream Inn. One of the fun stories I have, my father's uncle died, and he was in his 90s, and his name was Uncle Milton. And Uncle Milton lived with his sister. He never did a lot in life. He worked a little bit on tenant farms, some. And Uncle Milton died, so I had to take Dad to the funeral home, when the funeral home was the little house next to where, well, you all know where it is, but the little funeral home. And they had gotten the Baptist minister from Wiltseyville. I won't give you his name. His first name was Lee. And, starts, you're gifted, aren't you? But he was all ready to start, and of course, my father would get nervous going to the funeral home, so he wanted to stop to the Millstream and have a shot and a beer. So I says, Dad, we got to get to the funeral home. It's getting time for it to start. So we're getting ready to start, and Lee Mead is standing there waiting to start, and we're walking in, so I tried to hurry my father along, and he says, you don't got to help me, I can get up there. So we stood at the casket, and my father had this booming, deep voice where you could hear him all over. And I said, God, Uncle Milton looks awful peaceful, doesn't he? Dad says, Jesus Christ, he ought to. He never worked a day in his life. And then Lee started the service after Dad did the invocation. The Millstream had a wonderful waitress back in the 60s. A little short, stocky woman. Her name was Marguerite Jackson. Some of you may remember her. She was a cousin. She was a cousin to Janny. She went by the nickname of Baghdad. And you could hear her voice. It could cut right through steel. And she was so much fun to be around because she'd get so excited, and the more excited she'd get, the squeakier her voice would get. And so I would tell her things with my psychic work, and she'd say, don't tell me that! Don't tell me that! I don't need to know that! And so we had a lot of fun with Baghdad. I think it was a very enjoyable thing. Another fella that has to be mentioned with the Millstream Inn was a friend to all of us kids, and us kids looked out for him, and he looked out for us. His name was Harvey Manley. Harvey is now in the throes of dementia, and he doesn't know anybody much anymore. I talked to his nephew last week. Harvey is now 79 years old. He lives with a family in Endwell. And his physical health is good, but he just can't place anything. But the nephew said that he had mentioned Harvey's parents to him, and his eyes filled with tears. And some of you may remember Pee Wee Manley and his dad, and then he was named Pee Wee because he was about that high. And Jo Manley, Josephine, she worked at the school for a long time in the cafeteria. But I did Harvey's sister's funeral a few years ago, and he knew me. And then George Strednak, who died this summer, he always looked out for Harvey, and he would bring him often around here for us to see him. And he brought him to church a couple years ago, in my church in Benetton. And Harvey looked at me, and his eyes filled with tears, and he remembered all the fun that we had. Harvey always wanted to get in on the fun. And then when he did, he got scared. One time we were, and what would bring Harvey to the Millstream when I owned it was he could smell chicken wings being cooked at least 25 miles away. And he would always show up for chicken wings because I'd cook chicken wings for the crew at the end of the night, and Harvey would be there. He'd come in with his 2 packs of Lucky Strikes, and nobody could have ever got those away from him. Those were his cigarettes and nobody else's. One time we went to it was Halloween, and we said, well, we're going up, there's a cemetery up Gridleyville Way, and we're going up and get a real skeleton to decorate with for Halloween. Oh, Harvey goes, I'd like to do that too. So we got a shovel and we went up and we started up to the cemetery. And I said, who's that? Harvey says, I saw it too. And he beat us to the car. He beat us to the car. We weren't going to really dig up a skeleton, but he thought we were. The other thing that Harvey did that was so much fun for him, and last time I saw him, he remembered doing it. Usually around 10 or 11 o'clock at night, the younger men in town would go to the dam, take off their clothes, and go skinny dipping. It was, swimming nude was a big accomplishment for a teenage boy to go and skinny dip at the dam. And Harvey and a couple others, Harvey leading the way, he'd go over and take all their clothes and hide them in the bushes. So it would take them a long time to try to find their clothes in the bushes. And Harvey thought that was the greatest fun. Harvey really thought that was great fun. Some of the names that I think of when I think of the Millstream Inn is Scoonie and Gladys, Schoonover. Gladys, they called, her nickname was Happy Bottom. Gladys, Happy Bottom. But anyway, Scoonie and Gladys were part of it. Aunt Jen and Cease Taggart, some of you may remember, they lived on Bank Street, and Cease tended bar at various places around town. Aunt Jen and her sister, Georgia Galpin Koski, they would often sing at the bar at the Millstream. And one night my friend Corinne Craig, who was my sidekick, and I was her sidekick, it depended on which weekend it was, as to who was driving. And we were some of the first designated drivers. And we had been to a dance at the school. We were coming out of the school, and Aunt Jen always drove this great big white Bonneville, huge car. And it had just snowed, a very light snow, and Aunt Jen, we were coming out of school by the doctor's office there, and Aunt Jen went, I said, there goes Aunt Jen, she must be going to the Millstream. I'm sure she'd been up to the Legion where her husband was tending bar at that time, probably. There was this big cloud of white snow. Jen forgot to take the little turn onto the bridge, went up on the sidewalk, through the snow, and hit the end of the bridge and knocked the one section of bridge off into the creek. And I said to Corinne, we got to get over there, because Aunt Jen has just hit the bridge. And Corinne says, well, why don't we ride around town one time? And somebody else will get there first. And I said, well, we got to get there. It's Aunt Jen. So we went over and I opened the door of the Bonneville. And Jen sort of just rolled out on her hands and knees. And she looked up and she said, Philip, thank God you're here. I just hit a deer. I didn't find the deer or any tracks, but I would have swore she hit a bridge. Another couple I remember, and I think they were at the Legion more than the Millstream, but Gwen and Lester Houselander. And I remember Gwen because she always had rouge and bright red lipstick and big earrings. she always dressed to the nines to go out in downtown Candor. Then there was our friend Twig and Ida Twilliger. I was closing up the Millstream one night, and the kitchen lights were on, and the other part of the front part was dark, and her son had been in the Millstream, and he come home and took Twig's car and grabbed a six-pack out of the fridge, and Ida didn't like that very much. And when Ida didn't like something, you suffered. So pretty soon I see Ida coming. They were in the laundromat parking lot talking, the boys were. And I see Ida come in quite rapidly in her car into the parking lot. And I could see very clearly that she had on her fuzzy bedroom slippers, her nightgown, and her bathrobe, and it was a cold winter night. And she reprimanded the boys, got the six-pack, and made Bob come home. They'd been gone probably 10 minutes, and I got a phone call. Philip? I says, yeah. This is Ida. And she says, I saw you looking out those windows over there. And she says, you're lucky I didn't come over there. If I hadn't had on my bedroom slippers, I'd have been over there and told you what it was on. And that's how Ida was. And of course, some of the memories we have of like Dutch and Renee Haig and Chuck and Doris Whitmarsh, and another fellow that when I was young that went to the Millstream always, at least once a day, to get a quart of beer, and I think it was Topper beer, and I think it was 35 cents, and Augie Yost. Remember Augie Yost?
Yes.
And he would come and buy a quart of beer in a brown paper bag, go home, and maybe come back later that day. And I always remember Augie telling about how he took care of General Pershing's horse in World War I. So I guess that must be true. He told it to me enough as far as that goes. A lot of people that have worked at the Millstream Inn, and they feel that the place was haunted, that they could hear people walking up the stairs or down the stairs, or if they were, a lot of times if you'd go in the walk-in cooler downstairs, which was a wooden cooler that was, the insulation was sawdust, and you'd walk in that walk-in cooler and you'd know somebody was there, you'd say hello, and nobody'd answer. And I always thought, I'm not going to say hello because I'm afraid someone will answer. But I think it was Janny's mother who had an apparition upstairs, and she was.
I don't remember, but I think she was ill. She didn't feel well, and she went upstairs and went to bed early, and she heard a rattling next to the bed, and she looked up and she said she saw the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, that she saw the Blessed Virgin. If she was sick, that would have made me stop and think a little bit if I saw that. One of the other people that I didn't know well, but was a priest in town at St. Mark's who would go into the bar and have a beer with the guys. And the guys loved it because he didn't hold himself to be better than anybody else. His name was Charlie Sykes, Father Sykes. Some of you may remember Charlie and Emma Sykes. Emma, if you saw them as a couple, Emma would be about 10 feet ahead of Charlie, clearing the way for his eminence. And so Emma sort of wore the pants in that family, I think. But anyway, Emma was a rather robust gal, and she always had her hair pinned up, as I remember it. And Charlie and Emma Sykes. And Charlie was a well-loved priest in the town that many, many people certainly got to enjoy.
You know, I can remember my mother telling this story. She was standing bar, and one of the beer companies came with some of it, and she said, I gotta go downstairs. And, Father's like said, well, I'll 10 bar for you. So he got behind the bar and some guy come in and he didn't know him and he said, are you a father? And he said, yes, may I help you? And he said, no. And he left.
One of the other stories I remember was Georgia Koski, that was Aunt Jen's sister. As I said, they would often get singing and stuff. Well, Georgia was married to a man from Spencer by the name of Eno Koski. And he would imbibe a little bit once in a while. Well, up in West Candor, he went off the road down over a bank. And he crawled up over the bank, and the car behind him just happened to be Myron Miller on his way to make a pickup in Waverly with the hearse. And so Myron pulled over and to see if Eno was all right, didn't know it was Eno Koski, and Eno's crawling up over the bank, and he looks up at Myron, and he says, God, Myron, I knew you were good, but I didn't know you were that good. Myron Miller told me that story himself, so Myron Miller was quite a guy to have here in town. So those are my stories from the Millstream Inn. Do any of you have anything you want to ask or say or do? Yes.
Fred was very generous in maintaining the dam. I remember that. He put down a few bucks every year.
When we were young, the boards on the dam had to be replaced quite often, especially after high water. So it's a shame that the dam went out.
My father was head of, I don't know how you put it, but he was the one that raised the money to,
That's what he was saying.
to get the dam put back because he didn't want to see it go, and they were going to let it go at that time.
How the name the Millstream Inn came is because the mill right next door, there was the mill run, was right beside that operated the wheel, and I remember being told, and I don't know if it's true, but that mill had the first wheel that went this way in the water rather than this way in the water. And so they named it the Millstream Inn.
Joe Doty's wife is the one that named it. I can't remember her name.
Joe Doty's wife named it the Millstream Inn. And I remember the old mill because us younger boys would watch the older boys take their dirty magazines under the mill and hide them up in, and then we'd go in and find them. So that's how you could come to be a man. So, any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I had a story about the Millstream. Sometimes I like to run, and years ago, on a real hot day, I was taking a run from my house up on Honeybot Road, and I'd go run around the village, and I was coming by the Millstream, and I was thinking, I'm so hot and thirsty, wouldn't it be nice to have a beer? Well, what I didn't know was that right in front of the Millstream, this was when it was called Fitzpatrick's. They were trying to make an Irish pub of it. Well, one of their beer distributors was Guinness and Bass. They had this little green Ford van that had a little bar in it. It was parked right in front of the Millstream, and as I run by there, Alan Ehart sticks his hand out with a beer. Alan and Gene were in this little van. They had a little bar in there, and they were having a beer, and I guess you must have saw me coming right now. So they poured a beer, and just as I ran by the beer. Well, there is a God, So I had a beer, and I said, well, I better not have two, I won't make it home. I got to get home from here.
That's right. That's a wonderful story. Well, certainly the Millstream Inn has been a place where old friends meet, and unfortunately, it met its demise by falling in when put a hole in the side to put a door in. And I don't know how many years ago that was, but it certainly was a sad thing for us, because anybody that went to college would come home and meet at the mill stream. Anybody that went in the service would come home, and word would go around that so-and-so's home, we're gonna meet at the mill stream. And
I
we,
think also the kids that played sports, they'd play their sports and they'd all come to the mill stream to meet the other teams, you know.
yeah,
And we used to put a case of Pepsi, just put it on the floor, and the kids would help themselves. And then they,
rivals on the court, but friends.
yeah.
Truly a place where old friends meet. I want to thank you for asking me to do this. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have.
I
Thank you.
remember Janny jitterbugging.
Janny was a good
And
jitterbugger.
were they good?
Very good dancers. I danced many dances with her. Yeah. So.
You jitterbug too?
Yeah.
Go.
Her and Mary Lou Fields were the two best jitterbug dancers.
They were.
They were very good.
Betty Kessler was good too.
I didn't dance with Betty.
Well, Janny did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they did.
And again, I want to thank Janny for being here, and Jen for,
Yes.
and I told Jane that I'd never tell about us dragging her out of there drunk. That never happened. That was a lie. I admit to it. Fake news, as they say. Okay. Thank you again. Thank you. Thank you. It was fun. Take care.